No one ever paid attention to the night shift nurse. At St. Jude Memorial Hospital in Denver, the overnight hours belonged to shadows, cold fluorescent lights, and routines so familiar they became invisible. The silence in those corridors weighed heavier than exhaustion, and the people who worked through them learned to move without being noticed. Claire Dawson had perfected that art. She arrived at the same time every night, wore the same comfortable shoes, and avoided long conversations with anyone. To the exhausted doctors and the arrogant residents, she was nothing more than a functional presence, someone who completed her tasks without drawing attention and disappeared before the sun came up. Claire preferred it that way. Anonymity was not a burden for her. It was a gift she had fought hard to earn. At 43 years old, she had learned that the quietest corners of the world were often the safest. She had no desire to be seen, no hunger for recognition, and no interest in forming bonds that could be broken. Her life outside the hospital was simple. A small apartment near Cheeseman Park, a cat named Sargent, books about gardening that she never actually read, and silence. Precious, healing silence. That night, however, something felt different before anything happened. Claire noticed it first. It was not a loud noise or a sudden movement. It was the absence of expected sounds, a pattern broken in the building's circulation, an interval too long between two automatic security checks. While the hospital continued its slow rhythm, she registered details that no one else noticed. Internal doors unlocked outside of protocol. An elevator stuck between floors for 3 minutes longer than it should have been. Security cameras that flickered for fractions of a second before stabilizing. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe the maintenance team had been negligent. Maybe the storm predicted for later that night was already affecting the building's systems. But her instincts, sharpened by years she rarely allowed herself to remember, told her otherwise. Something was wrong. And whatever it was approaching. Claire continued her rounds, checking on patients in the East Wing, adjusting IV drips, and writing notes in charts that no one would read until morning. She smiled at Mrs. Henderson, an 80-year-old woman recovering from hip surgery who always asked about her cat. She reassured Mr. Kowalski, a retired firefighter who could never sleep through the night and always wanted someone to talk to. She moved through the corridors like water, present but unobtrusive, warm but distant. It was nearly 2 in the morning when she saw the first sign that her instincts had been right. A man she did not recognize walked past the nurse's station on the 3rd floor. He wore scrubs, but his shoes were wrong. They were tactical boots, the kind designed for situations far removed from hospital work. His posture was too rigid, his eyes too alert. He scanned the hallway the way a soldier scans a perimeter, not the way a tired orderly looks for a supply closet. Claire did not react visibly. She continued writing in her chart, her pen moving steadily across the paper, but her mind was already working, cataloging information, calculating possibilities. One man in the wrong shoes could be a coincidence, but she had learned long ago that coincidences were often the first warning signs of something much larger. She finished her note and walked toward the supply room at the end of the hall, her steps unhurried, her expression calm. Inside, she closed the door quietly and stood still for a moment, listening. The hospital hummed around her, machines beeping softly, ventilation systems breathing their mechanical breath. And beneath it all, she heard footsteps, too many footsteps, too coordinated, moving through the building with a purpose that had nothing to do with healing. Claire closed her eyes and allowed herself one deep breath. She had spent 15 years building this life, 15 years of quiet nights and empty weekends and deliberate solitude. 15 years of telling herself that the woman she used to be no longer existed. But standing there in that supply room, surrounded by bandages and syringes and the smell of antiseptic, she felt the old instincts rising like water through cracks in a dam. She opened her eyes and looked at her hands. They were steady. They had always been steady, even when everything around her was falling apart. That steadiness had saved lives once, in places she would never speak about, during missions that officially never happened. It had also cost her things she could never get back, a marriage that ended in silence, a daughter who stopped returning her calls, a version of herself that she had buried so deep She sometimes forgot it had ever existed. But tonight, that buried self was stirring, and Claire knew, with a certainty that felt like cold water in her chest, that before the sun rose, she would have to make a choice. She could remain invisible, let whatever was happening unfold without her interference, and protect the quiet life she had built. Or she could step out of the shadows and become someone she had promised herself she would never be again. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know who those men were or what they wanted. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. The night shift nurse was about to disappear, and in her place something older and more dangerous was about to wake up. Claire opened the supply room door and stepped back into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The hospital continued its slow, mechanical breathing, and somewhere in the building, footsteps that did not belong were getting closer. By 2:30, Claire had counted 7 of them. 7 men who did not belong, moving through the hospital with the kind of coordination that spoke of training and preparation. They wore scrubs and lab coats, blending into the environment like predators wearing the skins of their prey. But their movements betrayed them. They checked corners before turning them. They communicated with small gestures instead of words. They positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the building, controlling access without drawing attention. Claire watched from the edges, never stopping long enough to seem suspicious, never moving fast enough to attract notice. She pushed a medication cart down the 4th-floor corridor and counted 2 of them near the elevator bank. She helped a confused elderly patient find his room and spotted another one stationed near the emergency stairwell. She refilled water pitchers in the ICU and noticed 2 more standing near the main entrance. Their postures relaxed, but their eyes constantly scanning. The hospital had approximately 300 people inside at that hour, patients, staff, a handful of visitors who had special permission to stay overnight with loved ones. Most of them had no idea that anything was wrong. The men had not made any aggressive moves yet. They had not announced themselves or made demands. They were simply there, occupying space, waiting for something. Claire returned to the nurse's station on the 3rd floor and sat down at her usual computer. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up patient records she did not need to see, while her mind worked through the possibilities. This was not a robbery. Hospitals had drugs, but these men were not moving toward the pharmacy. This was not a random act of violence. Their positions were too deliberate, their timing too precise. She thought about the patients on each floor, the cardiac ward on 4, the oncology department on 5, the maternity unit on 2, the pediatric ward on 3, where she spent most of her shifts. None of these seemed like obvious targets. But somewhere in this building, there was someone these men wanted, and they had gone to extraordinary lengths to get close without triggering any alarms. The phone at the nurse's station rang, and Claire answered it with her usual calm greeting. It was Dr. Reyes from the ER, asking about a patient transfer scheduled for morning. Claire gave him the information he needed, her voice steady and professional, while her eyes tracked movement at the far end of the hallway. One of the men was walking toward her, his pace casual, his expression friendly. She hung up the phone just as he reached the station. He was young, maybe 30, with a forgettable face and eyes that were too sharp for someone pretending to be a hospital orderly. He smiled at her, the kind of smile designed to disarm. "Quiet night," he said. "They usually are," Claire replied. "Can I help you with something?" "Just getting oriented. I'm new. Started last week in facilities management, but they've got me floating around different departments, learning the building." Claire nodded, her expression polite and uninterested. "It's a big place, easy to get lost." "Yeah. Hey, do you know where the server room is? Someone mentioned something about a maintenance request, but I can't find it on any of the maps." The server room. Claire felt a small click in her mind, a piece of information falling into place. The server room controlled the hospital's communications, its security systems, its connection to the outside world. If these men wanted to isolate the building, that would be their first target. "Basement level," she said, keeping her voice casual. "But you need special access for that. You'll have to talk to security." The man's smile did not waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or recalculation. Right. Security. I'll do that. Thanks. He walked away, his steps just slightly too controlled, and Claire watched him go. She waited until he disappeared around the corner, then reached for the phone again. She dialed the security office on the first floor. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. She hung up and tried the main switchboard. Same result. The hospital's internal communication system was already compromised. Whatever these men were planning, it was about to begin. Claire stood up from the station and walked toward the supply closet at the end of the hall. Her movements were unhurried, her expression unchanged, but inside, the woman she used to be was fully awake now, assessing the situation with cold precision. 7 men minimum, probably more, communications cut, strategic positions throughout the building. This was not an improvisation, this was a military operation. And Claire Dawson, the invisible night shift nurse, was the only person in the building who recognized it for what it was. She stepped into the supply closet and closed the door behind her. In the darkness, surrounded by shelves of medical equipment, she allowed herself 5 seconds to feel the weight of what was coming. Then she pushed it aside and began to plan. The hospital fell under their control at exactly 3:17 in the morning. Claire knew the precise moment because she was watching the clock above the nurses' station when the lights flickered and the announcement came over the intercom. A man's voice, calm and authoritative, instructed all staff and patients to remain in their current locations. He explained that there was a situation being handled and that cooperation would ensure everyone's safety. He did not specify what kind of situation. He did not need to. Within minutes, the organized movements Claire had been tracking became open occupation. The men abandoned their disguises and revealed their true nature. They carried weapons, but more importantly, they carried authority. They directed people with firm commands and positioned themselves at every exit, every stairwell, every elevator. The hospital, which had been a place of healing and hope just moments before, became a cage. Claire remained at her station, watching as 2 of the men escorted the night supervisor away for questioning. She saw fear spreading through the corridors like a contagion, nurses clutching each other, patients calling out from their rooms, visitors crying into their phones before the signals were finally blocked completely. She absorbed it all, cataloging reactions, identifying those who might remain calm under pressure and those who might become liabilities. The man who had asked her about the server room returned, this time without the friendly smile. He stood in front of her station and looked at her with new eyes, assessing her the way she had been assessing him. "You're still here," he said. "Where would I go?" He studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the hallway. "We're consolidating staff in the main conference room on the 2nd floor. You'll need to come with me." Claire nodded and stood up slowly. She reached for her badge, her keys, the small flashlight she kept clipped to her scrubs. The man watched her movements with the alertness of someone trained to recognize threats. Good instincts. Not good enough. They walked together down the corridor, passing rooms where frightened patients pressed their call buttons over and over, not understanding why no one came. Claire felt the weight of their fear, but she could not afford to respond to it. Not yet. First, she needed to understand the full scope of what she was dealing with. She needed to know who these men were, what they wanted, and most importantly, who they were looking for. The conference room on the 2nd floor was crowded with hospital staff, doctors, nurses, technicians, administrative workers who had been unfortunate enough to be working the night shift. They sat in clusters, some whispering urgently, others staring at the walls with blank expressions. Armed men stood at both doors, their faces impassive, their weapons visible but not raised. Claire found a seat near the back of the room, positioning herself where she could see both exits and most of the other hostages. She recognized many of the faces around her. Dr. Martinez from Pediatrics, who always brought donuts on Fridays. Sarah Chen, the young respiratory therapist who was planning her wedding. Bill Thompson, the elderly security guard who had worked at St. Jude for 30 years and knew every corner of the building. She made note of who seemed calm and who seemed on the edge of panic. She watched the armed men, studying their communication patterns, their body language, the subtle hierarchy that existed among them. There was a leader somewhere, someone giving orders, but he had not revealed himself yet. These men were soldiers, not commanders. They followed instructions and maintained discipline, but they were not the ones making decisions. An hour passed, then another. The conference room grew stuffy and tense. People asked to use the bathroom and were escorted one at a time under armed guard. Water was brought in, but no food. The men answered no questions and offered no explanations. They simply waited, as if the whole operation was on pause until some predetermined moment arrived. Claire used the time to think. She reconstructed the layout of the hospital in her mind, every corridor and stairwell, every storage room and maintenance shaft. She had worked here for 5 years, and she knew the building better than most. But more than that, she understood buildings like this on a fundamental level. She understood how they breathed, how they moved, how they could be used as weapons or shields depending on who controlled them. She also thought about who might be the target of this operation. St. Jude Memorial was a civilian hospital with no obvious military or political significance. Its patients were ordinary people with ordinary illnesses. Its staff were dedicated professionals who had chosen careers in healing. There was no obvious reason for a group of trained operatives to take such extreme measures, unless the target was hidden, unless someone in this building was not who they appeared to be. Claire looked around the conference room again, this time with different eyes. She studied the faces of her colleagues, looking for signs of deception or fear that went beyond the normal response to the situation. She examined the doctors and nurses she had worked beside for years, wondering if any of them carried secrets as heavy as her own. And then, in the far corner of the room, she saw him, a man she had never noticed before, despite working the same shift for months. He sat alone, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the floor. He wore the uniform of a hospital orderly, but his hands were not the hands of someone who pushed mops and emptied trash cans. They were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who had done difficult work in difficult places. Claire felt a cold recognition settle in her chest. She did not know his name or his story, but she knew his type. She had served alongside men like him in another life, in places where the rules of civilization did not apply. He was military, like her. He was hiding, like her. And whoever these armed men were, they were here for him. The question was whether Claire would let them find him. The man in the corner did not look up, but Claire knew he was aware of her attention. People who had survived the kinds of experiences that left those particular scars on their hands developed a sixth sense for being watched. He would feel her gaze like a physical weight, and he would be deciding right now whether she was a threat or simply another frightened hostage looking for reassurance. Claire looked away, careful not to stare too long. She needed more information before she made any decisions. She needed to understand the full picture before she stepped into a conflict that was not hers to fight. The woman she had become over the past 15 years wanted nothing more than to sit quietly, wait for the authorities to arrive, and let someone else handle this situation. But the woman she used to be, the one who had spent 12 years in the United States Army Rangers, knew that waiting was not always an option. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember, just for a moment, Fort Benning, Georgia, where she had earned her Ranger tab against all odds, one of the first women to complete the program. The mountains of Afghanistan, where she had led reconnaissance missions into territory so hostile that maps simply labeled it as empty space. The intelligence operations that took her to places she could never name, doing things she could never discuss, serving a country that would never acknowledge her sacrifices. And then, the mission that ended everything, the one that still visited her in nightmares 15 years later. The betrayal that came from within, the operation that went wrong in ways that should have been impossible, the faces of the people she could not save. Claire had survived that night, but something inside her had not. She had returned home with a medical discharge, a folder full of commendations that would never be made public, and a burning desire to disappear. Nursing had seemed like the perfect escape. It allowed her to use her medical training, which had been extensive during her military career. It gave her a purpose that felt meaningful after years of destruction, and most importantly, it let her become invisible. No one looked twice at a middle-aged nurse working the overnight shift. No one asked questions about her past or wondered about the scars hidden beneath her scrubs. She had built a new identity so carefully that sometimes she almost believed it herself. But now, sitting in this conference room surrounded by frightened colleagues and armed men, she felt the old self stirring. The tactical mind that had never really gone quiet began analyzing escape routes and defensive positions. The trained observer noted which of the armed men seemed most alert and which showed signs of fatigue. The soldier, who had sworn to protect innocence, looked around the room and saw hundreds of people whose lives might depend on decisions made in the next few hours. A commotion near the door interrupted her thoughts. 2 more armed men entered the conference room, escorting a new group of hostages. Among them was Dr. Nathan Cross, the chief of surgery, a man whose reputation for arrogance was matched only by his skill in the operating room. He was arguing loudly with his captors, demanding to know who was in charge, threatening consequences that would never materialize. Claire watched as one of the armed men responded to his protests with a sharp command and a gesture toward an empty chair. Dr. Cross fell silent, his face red with anger and humiliation, and took his seat among the other hostages. It was a small moment, but it revealed something important. These men were disciplined, but they were also human. They could be provoked, distracted, manipulated. They had weaknesses that could be exploited by someone who knew how to look for them. The hours continued to pass. The conference room grew more uncomfortable as fear gave way to exhaustion and basic physical needs became harder to ignore. Children from the pediatric ward were brought in, accompanied by their parents and the nurses who had been caring for them. Claire watched as Sarah Chen moved immediately to comfort a young boy who was crying for his mother. Her own fear pushed aside in the face of a child's distress. This was why Claire had become a nurse, not for the technical challenges or the decent salary, but for moments like this, moments when ordinary people found extraordinary courage because someone else needed them. She had seen that same courage on battlefields, in soldiers who ran toward danger to save their friends. It looked different in a hospital setting, wrapped in gentle words and soft touches instead of body armor and weapons, but it was the same fundamental impulse, the willingness to put someone else's needs above your own fear. Claire made her decision. She could not sit here and wait while innocent people remained in danger. She could not pretend to be invisible while children cried and colleagues trembled. Whatever these armed men wanted, whatever secrets the man in the corner was hiding, she had skills that could make a difference. And after 15 years of running from who she used to be, maybe it was time to stop. She began to plan. First, she needed to understand the full scope of the operation. How many men were involved? What were their positions throughout the hospital? What was their ultimate objective? She had some of this information already, gathered during her observations before the takeover, but she needed more. Second, she needed allies. She could not take on a trained tactical team alone, but she might be able to coordinate with others who had useful skills or knowledge. Bill Thompson, the security guard, knew the building systems better than anyone. Dr. Martinez had military experience from his time as a Navy medic. There might be others whose backgrounds included training that could prove valuable. Third, she needed to establish communication with the outside world. The armed men had cut the hospital's phone lines and jammed cell signals, but there might be other options. Emergency radios, backup systems, physical methods of signaling for help. The hospital was not completely isolated, and someone outside must have noticed that something was wrong by now. Claire opened her eyes and looked around the conference room with new purpose. She was no longer a frightened hostage waiting to be rescued. She was a soldier, assessing a battlefield, preparing for a mission that no one had assigned, but that she had chosen to accept. The invisible night shift nurse was about to become visible, and the men who had taken this hospital would learn that they had made a serious miscalculation. The leader finally revealed himself just before dawn. His name, Claire would later learn, was Ethan Cole. He walked into the conference room with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he was in complete control, flanked by 2 of his most trusted operatives. He was younger than Claire had expected, perhaps 40, with close-cropped grey hair and eyes that had seen too much to ever be truly warm again. He stood at the front of the room and surveyed the hostages with an expression that was almost apologetic. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, the voice of someone explaining a difficult situation to people he genuinely did not want to harm. "I know you're all frightened," he began. "I know this is not how any of you expected to spend your night. I want you to understand that we have no intention of hurting anyone in this room. We are here for a specific purpose, and once that purpose is achieved, we will leave. Your cooperation will make this process faster and safer for everyone." A murmur ran through the crowd. Dr. Cross started to speak, but a sharp look from Ethan silenced him before he could form words. "I'm going to ask you all to remain calm and patient. My men will continue to provide water and access to restroom facilities. Anyone with urgent medical needs will be attended to by your own staff under our supervision. We are not monsters. We are simply people who have been failed by a system that was supposed to protect us, seeking justice through the only means left available." Claire listened carefully, analyzing not just his words, but the way he delivered them. Ethan Cole was not a common criminal or a desperate man driven to extreme measures by circumstance. He was a professional, probably former military or intelligence, conducting an operation that he believed was righteous. That made him more dangerous than a simple thug, but also potentially more predictable. Men with causes followed patterns. They had lines they would not cross and principles they would not abandon. She also noticed what he did not say. He made no demands, issued no ultimatums, set no deadlines. This was not a hostage situation in the traditional sense. He was not trying to negotiate with authorities or extract concessions from the hospital administration. He wanted something specific inside the building, and he intended to find it regardless of what anyone else did. Her eyes drifted to the man in the corner, the one with the scarred hands. He had not reacted to Ethan's speech, had not looked up or shown any sign of recognition. But his stillness was too perfect, too controlled. He was a man trying very hard not to be noticed, which meant he knew exactly why these armed men were here. After Ethan finished his address and left the room, Claire began to move. She approached Sarah Chen first, kneeling beside her as if to check on the young boy she was comforting. "How are you holding up?" Claire asked softly. Sarah looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "I'm terrified. What do they want? Why is this happening?" "I don't know yet, but I need you to do something for me. I need you to stay calm and keep the children calm. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, drawing strength from Claire's steady presence. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to figure out what's happening, and then I'm going to try to help. But I need to know I can count on you to maintain order here while I'm working." Sarah looked at Claire with new eyes, seeing something in the older nurse that she had never noticed before. "Who are you really?" Claire smiled, a small, sad smile that held 15 years of buried secrets. "Right now, I'm just someone who wants to get us all out of this safely. That's all that matters." She moved on, stopping next to Bill Thompson, the security guard. Bill was in his 60s, a Vietnam veteran who had spent his career protecting places and people he cared about. His hands were shaking slightly, but his eyes were alert. "Bill," Claire said quietly, sitting down beside him, "I need to ask you some questions about the building. Emergency systems, backup communications, anything that might not be on the official blueprints." Bill looked at her with surprise that quickly turned to understanding. He had spent 30 years reading people, and he recognized something in Claire that went beyond her nurse's uniform. "There's an old emergency radio in the basement," he said, keeping his voice low, "installed back in the 80s during the Cold War scares. Management forgot about it years ago, but I kept it maintained, just in case." "Can you tell me exactly where it is?" Bill described the location in detail, a small utility room behind the boiler system that was not on any current maps. Claire memorized every word, creating a mental image of the route she would need to take. "There's something else," Bill added. "The hospital has an old tunnel system, used to connect to the building next door before it was demolished. Most of the tunnels are sealed, but there's one that leads to a storm drain about 2 blocks away. I used to smoke down there during my breaks, before I quit." Claire felt a spark of hope, an escape route that the armed men probably did not know about, a way to get people out if everything else failed. "Thank you, Bill, this could save lives." She stood to move on, but Bill caught her arm. His grip was gentle but insistent. "Voice, whoever you really are," he said, "be careful. These men are professionals. I've seen their type before, back in the war. They won't hesitate if they think you're a threat." Claire nodded. "I know exactly what they are. That's why I might be the only one who can stop them. The first opportunity came 3 hours after Ethan Cole's address. One of the armed men entered the conference room and began calling out names from a list, selecting specific hospital staff members for individual questioning. Claire listened carefully to the names being called. Dr. Cross, the head of human resources. 2 administrators from the records department. They were looking for information, trying to identify someone through official channels. When her own name was not called, Claire felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Being questioned would have been dangerous, but it also would have given her a chance to gather more intelligence about the operation. Instead, she would have to find other ways to learn what she needed to know. She waited until the guards were distracted by the departure of the selected staff members, then moved casually toward the corner of the room where the man with scarred hands sat alone. She lowered herself into a chair beside him, not looking directly at him, keeping her posture relaxed and non-threatening. "You know why they're here," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm pretty sure they're here for you." The man did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and tired, the voice of someone who had been running for a very long time. "You should stay away from me. Everyone who gets close to me ends up getting hurt. That's not really an option anymore, not for any of us." Claire paused, choosing her next words carefully. "My name is Claire. I work the night shift in pediatrics, but that's not all I am, and I think you already know that." The man finally looked at her, his eyes searching her face for deception or threat. What he found there made him relax slightly, the recognition of a kindred spirit. "Marcus Webb," he said. "Say former Army intelligence. I've been hiding here for 8 months, working as an orderly, trying to stay invisible. What do they want from you?" Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with guilt and exhaustion. 12 years ago, I was part of a classified operation. Things went wrong. People were betrayed from the inside. The official story blamed it on enemy intelligence. But I knew the truth. I kept evidence, documents that proved what really happened and who was responsible. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. 12 years ago, the same time frame as her own disastrous mission, the same pattern of betrayal and cover-up. "These men," Marcus continued, "they work for the people who want that evidence destroyed. They've been hunting me for years, and somehow they finally tracked me here. If they find what I'm hiding, they'll destroy it. And the truth will be buried forever. Where is the evidence now? Hidden in the hospital, somewhere they won't think to look." Marcus shook his head. "But it doesn't matter. They'll tear this place apart until they find it, and they'll hurt innocent people in the process. Because of me. Because I was too stubborn to just let go of the past." Claire recognized the guilt in his voice because she felt it herself, the weight of secrets that affected others, the burden of knowledge that could not be safely shared. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "Whatever happened 12 years ago, whatever truth you're protecting, it matters. But right now, the only thing that matters is getting these people out safely. Can you help me do that?" Marcus looked at her with something like hope flickering in his exhausted eyes. "Who are you, really? Someone who understands exactly what you've been through. Someone who made similar choices and paid similar prices, and someone who is not going to let these men win." She stood up and moved away before their conversation could attract attention, but a connection had been formed, an alliance built on shared experience and mutual recognition. Marcus Webb was no longer alone, and neither was Claire. The next several hours required patience and careful observation. Claire returned to her role as an invisible hostage, watching and waiting for opportunities. She noticed that the guards changed shifts every 4 hours, with a brief period of overlap that created momentary confusion. She observed that certain areas of the hospital seemed to receive less attention than others, possibly because the armed men had limited personnel and could not watch everything simultaneously. She also noticed cracks forming within the enemy's ranks. 2 of the guards argued quietly near the door, their disagreement visible in their body language, even though their words were too soft to hear. Another man seemed increasingly nervous, checking his watch repeatedly and glancing toward the windows as if expecting something. Ethan Cole's calm control was holding his team together, but stress was beginning to show. Claire filed away every observation, building a picture of the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. She was beginning to formulate a plan, a way to use the hospital's structure and her own skills to shift the balance of power. It would be dangerous. It might not work. But sitting passively while innocent people remained in danger was no longer acceptable. As the morning sun began to brighten the windows of the conference room, Claire made her move. She approached one of the guards, the nervous one who kept checking his watch, and complained of chest pains. Her performance was convincing enough that he agreed to let her visit the restroom, escorted by a colleague. The restroom was on the second floor, a short distance from the conference room. Claire entered alone, while the guard waited outside. She had perhaps 3 minutes before he would become suspicious. She moved quickly to the window and examined it carefully. It was designed to open only a few inches for ventilation, but the locking mechanism was simple. Using a hairpin she had kept hidden in her pocket, she disabled the lock in under 30 seconds. The window now appeared closed, but could be opened fully with a simple push. An escape route, not for now, but for later, when the time was right. Claire flushed the toilet, washed her hands, and returned to the guard with a grateful smile. He escorted her back to the conference room without suspicion. One small victory. Many more would be needed before this night was over. By midday, the atmosphere inside St. Jude Memorial Hospital had shifted from acute terror to a grinding tension that wore on everyone's nerves. The hostages in the conference room had settled into an uneasy routine, their initial panic replaced by exhaustion and the peculiar numbness that comes from prolonged stress. Children slept in their parents' arms. Elderly patients dozed in uncomfortable chairs. Even the armed guards seemed tired, their alertness dulled by hours of standing watch over people who posed no obvious threat. Claire used this lull to continue her preparations. She had identified 3 potential allies among the hostages: Bill Thompson, with his knowledge of the building's hidden spaces, Dr. Martinez, whose military medical background might prove useful, and Sarah Chen, whose position near the children gave her access to a section of the room that received less guard attention. She had communicated with each of them through brief, seemingly innocent conversations, establishing a basic understanding without revealing the full scope of her intentions. She had also been observing Marcus Webb, watching how he handled the stress of knowing he was the target of this entire operation. To his credit, he maintained his composure, never drawing attention to himself, never doing anything that might single him out from the other hostages. But Claire could see the guilt eating at him, the knowledge that every person in this room was suffering because of secrets he had chosen to protect. The questioning of staff members continued throughout the morning. Those who were taken away returned looking shaken, but unharmed, reporting that they had been asked detailed questions about hospital employees, particularly anyone who had been hired in the past year. The armed men were working through the staff systematically, trying to identify Marcus through official records. It was only a matter of time before they connected his false identity to his real one. Claire knew she needed to act before that happened, but she also knew that acting too soon, before she fully understood the enemy's capabilities and limitations, could get people hurt. It was the same calculus she had performed dozens of times during her military career, weighing risk against reward, patience against urgency. Her opportunity came in the early afternoon, when a minor crisis diverted the guards' attention. An elderly patient in the conference room experienced what appeared to be a cardiac episode, clutching his chest and gasping for breath. Dr. Martinez rushed to his side, calling for assistance, and for a few chaotic minutes, all eyes were focused on the medical emergency. Claire slipped away during the confusion. She moved toward the door, timing her steps to coincide with moments when the guards were looking elsewhere, and exited the conference room without being challenged. Once in the hallway, she transformed her body language completely. The frightened hostage disappeared, replaced by a woman who moved with purpose and authority. She had perhaps 15 minutes before someone noticed her absence. 15 minutes to accomplish something meaningful. The basement was her first destination. Bill Thompson had described the location of the emergency radio in detail, and Claire navigated the hospital's lower levels with the confidence of someone who had memorized every turn. She avoided the areas where she knew guards were stationed, using maintenance corridors and service staircases that the armed men had apparently overlooked. The utility room was exactly where Bill had described it. a dusty, forgotten space filled with obsolete equipment and decades of accumulated clutter. The emergency radio sat on a metal shelf in the corner, covered with a layer of grime, but otherwise intact. Claire wiped it clean and examined the controls. It was an older model, but she had trained on similar equipment during her military service. She powered it on and felt a surge of relief when the indicator lights flickered to life. The radio still worked. She tuned it to an emergency frequency and began transmitting. "This is a civilian emergency broadcast from St. Jude Memorial Hospital in Denver. The facility has been taken over by armed individuals. Approximately 300 hostages are being held inside. Repeat, this is not a drill. We need immediate assistance." She transmitted the message 3 times, then switched to receive mode and listened. Static, more static, and then, faintly, a response. "St. Jude Memorial. This is Denver Emergency Services. We copy your transmission. Please confirm your situation and provide any additional details." Claire felt tears prick her eyes, the first sign of emotion she had allowed herself since the takeover began. Help was coming. The outside world knew what was happening. They were no longer alone. She provided a rapid summary of what she knew, the number of armed men she had counted, their positions throughout the hospital, the fact that they seemed to be searching for a specific individual, rather than making traditional hostage demands. She described the conference room where most hostages were being held and mentioned the unlocked window she had prepared as a potential evacuation route. "Understood. St. Jude Memorial. Police and emergency response teams are en route. ETA approximately 45 minutes. Can you maintain communication?" Claire hesitated. Staying by the radio would limit her ability to help inside the hospital, but maintaining contact with emergency services could prove crucial. "I'll try to check back every hour, but I may not be able to stay in this location continuously." "Copy that. Be careful." "Help is on the way." Claire switched off the radio and took a moment to collect herself. The first phase of her plan had succeeded. Now came the harder part. She made her way back toward the upper floors, moving carefully through the hospital's maze of corridors. Along the way, she observed the enemy's positions, noting which areas were heavily guarded and which had been left relatively unprotected. The armed men had focused their attention on the main entrances, the communication systems, and the areas where hostages were concentrated. But they could not watch everything, and their limited numbers left gaps that a skilled infiltrator could exploit. On the 3rd floor, she encountered her first serious obstacle. 2 guards were stationed at the entrance to the pediatric ward, where several young patients remained in their rooms under the care of a skeleton nursing staff. Claire needed to pass through this area to reach the conference room without attracting attention, but there was no obvious way around the checkpoint. She considered her options. She could try to bluff her way through, claiming she had been sent on an errand by one of the other guards. She could create a distraction and slip past during the confusion, or she could find another route entirely, even if it cost her precious time. Before she could decide, one of the guards noticed her standing in the hallway. His hand moved toward his weapon as he called out, "Hey, you, what are you doing out here?" Claire made her choice in an instant. She let her shoulders slump, her face crumple into an expression of fear and confusion. She became once again the invisible night shift nurse. I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I got lost trying to find the bathroom." "Please, I just want to go back to the others." The guard studied her for a moment, his suspicion warring with the assessment that this middle-aged woman in rumpled scrubs posed no threat. Finally, he gestured impatiently. "Conference room is that way. Don't let me catch you wandering around again." Claire nodded gratefully and hurried in the direction he had indicated. She felt his eyes on her back as she walked, but she maintained her performance until she was out of sight. Only then did she allow herself a small smile of satisfaction. The invisible woman had proven useful once again. Claire returned to the conference room without incident, slipping back inside during another moment of distraction. No one seemed to have noticed her absence, or if they had, they attributed it to a bathroom break that had taken longer than expected. She found her seat and settled in, resuming her role as just another frightened hostage. But inside, everything had changed. Help was coming. The outside world was aware of their situation. All she had to do now was keep people safe until the rescue arrived and prevent the armed men from finding Marcus before then. She caught Marcus's eye across the room and gave him an almost imperceptible nod. He understood. Something had happened, something that gave them reason for hope. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, though his vigilance remained. The afternoon wore on. More staff members were questioned and returned. The armed men grew increasingly frustrated as their search failed to produce results. Claire could see Ethan Cole conferring with his lieutenants, their body language suggesting disagreement about how to proceed. The cracks she had noticed earlier were widening. Around 4 in the afternoon, the situation escalated. Ethan entered the conference room personally, his calm demeanor showing signs of strain. He announced that the search process was taking too long and that more aggressive measures would be necessary. Starting immediately, hostages would be separated into smaller groups and questioned individually about their knowledge of hospital staff members. Fear rippled through the room. Individual questioning meant isolation, vulnerability, the possibility of pressure tactics that the armed men had so far avoided. Claire saw parents pulling their children closer, colleagues exchanging worried glances. The fragile equilibrium that had held throughout the day was threatening to shatter. She knew she had to act, not with violence, not with confrontation, but with the only weapon she had always been able to rely on, her ability to read people and situations. She stood up slowly, drawing attention to herself for the first time since the takeover began. The guards nearest to her tensed, hands moving toward weapons, but she kept her posture non-threatening, her voice calm. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Ethan directly. "May I speak with you?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward the unremarkable nurse who had suddenly stepped out of the background. Ethan studied her with interest, perhaps recognizing something in her bearing that set her apart from the other hostages. "And who are you?" "My name is Claire Dawson. I'm a nurse on the night shift. I've worked here for 5 years, and I know everyone in this room. If you're looking for someone specific, I might be able to help you find them faster than this process you're describing." Murmurs of confusion and betrayal rippled through the hostages. They thought she was offering to collaborate with the enemy, to sell out one of their own. Claire felt their judgment but ignored it. She knew what she was doing, even if they did not. Ethan considered her offer. She could see him weighing the risks and benefits, trying to determine whether she was genuinely helpful or attempting some kind of trick. "Why would you want to help us?" "Because I want this to end. I want these people to go home to their families. I want the children in this room to stop being terrified, and I don't want anyone to get hurt because your frustration leads to decisions you might regret." It was a calculated appeal, designed to resonate with the principles she had observed in Ethan's earlier address. He was a man who believed in his cause, who wanted to achieve his objectives without unnecessary harm. She was offering him a path that aligned with those values. After a long moment, Ethan nodded. "Come with me. We'll talk privately." Claire followed him out of the conference room, aware of the hostile stares from her colleagues and the curious glances from the guards. She was walking a dangerous line, but it was the only way she could think of to buy time and gather more intelligence. They walked to a small office on the second floor that had been converted into a command center. Maps of the hospital were spread across a desk, marked with positions and patrol routes. Communication equipment lined one wall. Ethan gestured for her to sit, then took a seat across from her. "You're not what you appear to be," he said. It was not a question. Claire met his gaze steadily. "Neither are you. You're not criminals. You're soldiers. Or you used to be. This operation has military precision, military discipline. Whatever you're looking for, it's not money or drugs." Ethan's expression flickered with surprise before settling back into careful neutrality. "You're observant. I've had practice, different life, long time ago." "Who were you in that different life?" "Someone who made difficult choices in impossible situations. Someone who knows what it's like to believe in a cause so strongly that you're willing to sacrifice everything for it." Claire paused, letting her words sink in. "I also know what it's like to realize that the cause was built on lies, and I know how much that betrayal can cost." Something shifted in Ethan's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of doubt. "You don't know anything about why we're here," he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I know you're looking for a man named Marcus Webb. I know he has evidence about something that happened 12 years ago, something that was covered up by people in positions of power, and I know that destroying that evidence won't change what happened. It will only ensure that the people responsible never face justice." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "How do you know that name?" "Because he told me. Because he's been carrying this burden alone for years, and he's tired of running. Because the truth he's protecting matters, even if revealing it costs him everything." "The truth?" Ethan laughed bitterly. "You want to talk about truth? The truth is that Marcus Webb betrayed his own team. He got good people hurt because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. He leaked classified information that compromised an operation years in the planning. And then he disappeared before he could face the consequences." Claire felt the words like physical blows. This was not the story Marcus had told her. Either he had lied, or Ethan had been given false information, or perhaps the truth was more complicated than either of them understood. What if the information he leaked revealed something that needed to be exposed? She asked carefully. "Foz, what if the operation he compromised was itself criminal?" "You don't know what you're talking about. Then help me understand, because right now you have 300 innocent people caught in the middle of a conflict they know nothing about. Whatever happened 12 years ago, they don't deserve to suffer for it." Ethan turned away, staring at the maps on the desk without really seeing them. Claire could see the conflict playing out across his features, the war between his mission and his conscience. "We were brothers," he said finally, his voice rough. "Marcus and I served together for 6 years. I would have trusted him with my life, and then he destroyed everything we had built." Understanding dawned on Claire. This was not just about evidence or cover-ups. This was personal. Ethan was not simply following orders. He was seeking revenge for a betrayal that had shattered his world. "Ethan," she said softly, "I understand betrayal better than you know, but revenge won't give you peace. It won't bring back whatever you lost. It will only add more weight to the burden you're already carrying." He turned to face her, and for a moment she saw past the soldier, past the leader, to the wounded man beneath. "Then, what am I supposed to do? Just let him go? Pretend none of it happened? Find the truth, the real truth, not the version you were told by people who had their own reasons for wanting Marcus silenced. Talk to him, listen to what he has to say, and then decide what justice really looks like." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Claire could see Ethan wrestling with her words, fighting against years of anger and certainty. She did not know if she had reached him, but she had planted a seed. Sometimes that was all anyone could do. The uneasy peace shattered at 7:23 in the evening. Claire was back in the conference room, having been escorted there by a guard after her conversation with Ethan ended without clear resolution. She had been sitting quietly, processing what she had learned and trying to formulate her next move, when the first sounds of commotion reached her ears. Shouts from the hallway, running footsteps. The sharp crackle of radio communication. Something had changed, and whatever it was had thrown the armed men into sudden activity. One of the guards burst into the conference room and spoke urgently to his colleagues. Claire could not hear the words, but the effect was immediate. The guards' postures shifted from bored vigilance to high alert. One of them began herding hostages away from the windows, while the other took up a defensive position near the door. Police. Emergency response teams had arrived. The 45-minute estimate the dispatcher had given must have been optimistic, or perhaps they had been staging nearby, waiting for the right moment to act. Either way, the situation had just become much more volatile. Claire knew that hostage situations became most dangerous during the transition from standoff to resolution. The armed men would be feeling cornered, their options narrowing. Mistakes became more likely on both sides. And in the chaos that followed, innocent people could get hurt. She needed to act quickly. She caught Bill Thompson's eye and gave him a meaningful look, then did the same with Dr. Martinez and Sarah Chen. They understood. Whatever was about to happen, they needed to be ready. The next hour was a blur of tension and uncertainty. Through the windows, Claire could see flashing lights in the distance, the perimeter that was being established around the hospital. Inside, the armed men were reinforcing their positions, moving hostages to more defensible locations, preparing for a confrontation they had hoped to avoid. Ethan Cole moved through the building like a man possessed, issuing orders, checking positions, trying to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his grasp. Claire watched him through the conference room door during one of his passes and saw something in his face that gave her hope. He was not preparing for a final stand. He was looking for a way out. The opportunity came just before 9 o'clock. One of the guards received a message on his radio and left his post briefly, leaving only one man watching the conference room door. At the same moment, a power fluctuation caused the lights to flicker, creating a moment of confusion and darkness. Claire moved. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides and reached Bill Thompson's side. "The tunnel," she whispered. "Can you lead people to it?" Bill nodded, his old soldier's instincts kicking in despite his years. "I can get there with my eyes closed. Start with the children and their families. Sarah will help you organize them. Move in small groups, stay quiet, and don't stop until you reach the storm drain." She turned to Dr. Martinez next. "I need you to create a distraction. Something medical, something that will draw attention away from the back of the room." Martinez understood immediately. "I know just the thing." Within minutes, the plan was in motion. Martinez approached the remaining guard with urgent claims that one of the elderly patients was having a serious medical episode. The guard, already stressed by the police presence outside, followed him to investigate. In that moment, Bill Thompson quietly gathered the first group of children and their parents and led them toward a service door at the back of the conference room. Claire watched the evacuation begin with a mixture of hope and fear. They were committed now. If the armed men discovered what was happening before enough people escaped, the consequences could be severe. But doing nothing was no longer an option. The situation outside was evolving too quickly, and she could not trust that the resolution would come without violence. Group by group, the hostages slipped away. Bill Thompson knew the path to the tunnel perfectly, guiding frightened families through basement corridors and forgotten passages. Sarah Chen kept the children calm, with whispered reassurances and gentle touches. "Doctor." Martinez continued to manage distractions, inventing one medical concern after another to keep the guards occupied. Claire remained in the conference room, coordinating the evacuation while maintaining the appearance that nothing unusual was happening. She positioned remaining hostages to conceal the diminishing numbers, adjusted seating arrangements to fill obvious gaps, created the illusion of a crowd that was slowly but surely evaporating. By 10:30, more than half the hostages had escaped through the tunnel. Reports would later confirm that they emerged from the storm drain 2 blocks away, where they were immediately taken into protective custody by waiting police officers. Children were reunited with frantic relatives. Parents wept with relief. The nightmare was ending for dozens of people who had spent the day convinced they might never see their homes again. But inside the hospital, the most dangerous moment was still approaching. Ethan Cole had finally noticed that something was wrong. The conference room seemed emptier than it should be. The faces he remembered from his earlier address were missing. Someone had been moving hostages out from under his nose, and he intended to find out who. He strode into the conference room with fury in his eyes, scanning the remaining hostages until his gaze landed on Claire. She met his look without flinching, knowing that her deception had been discovered and that the consequences were about to unfold. "You," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What have you done?" Claire stood slowly, placing herself between Ethan and the remaining hostages. "I've done what I had to do, what you would have done if you were in my position. You've just made everything worse. Do you understand that? The police are outside and my men are on edge, and now you've taken away the only leverage I had. Your leverage was innocent people, children, families. They didn't deserve to be pawns in whatever game you're playing." Ethan stepped closer, close enough that she could see the veins pulsing in his temple, the desperation beneath his anger. "This isn't a game. This is about justice. This is about making sure the people who destroyed my life face consequences. Then face them yourself. Stop hiding behind hostages and operations and tactical plans. If you want justice, go out there and tell the truth, all of it. Let the world decide who the real villains are." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge that cut through all the layers of strategy and revenge. Claire saw Ethan's certainty waver, saw the possibility of a different choice flickering in his eyes, and then, before either of them could speak again, the hospital's fire alarm began to scream. The fire alarm transformed the hospital into a symphony of chaos. Strobing lights painted the corridors in pulses of red and white. The piercing wail drowned out voices and commands. Sprinkler systems activated in some sections, sending cascades of water onto floors and equipment. Whatever slim control Ethan Cole had maintained over the situation evaporated in an instant. Claire did not know who had triggered the alarm. Perhaps it was one of the escaping hostages, hoping to create additional confusion. Perhaps it was the police outside, using it as cover for an imminent breach. Perhaps it was simply a malfunction, the universe adding one more layer of disorder to an already impossible night. The cause did not matter. What mattered was how she used this moment. She grabbed the arm of the nearest hostage, an administrative assistant named Patricia, who had been quietly weeping for hours. "Stay low and move toward the back door. Bill showed you the way. Go now." Patricia hesitated for only a second before survival instinct took over. She gathered 2 other remaining hostages, and they moved together, slipping through the service door that had become a lifeline throughout the evening. Claire watched them disappear into the darkness of the basement corridor, then turned back to face Ethan. He stood in the center of the conference room, his radio crackling with frantic reports from his men throughout the building. The disciplined operation he had commanded was fragmenting. His team members were reporting police movement at multiple entrances. The communications blackout they had established was failing. Escape routes were being cut off one by one. "Okay, it's over," Claire said, her voice cutting through the alarm's wail. "You have to see that. Whatever you came here to do, it's not going to happen. Not tonight. Not like this." Ethan's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, rage at the failure of his mission, fear of the consequences awaiting him, and somewhere beneath it all, something that looked almost like relief. The burden he had been carrying was about to be lifted one way or another. "You don't understand," he said. "If I walk out of here without completing the mission, the people I work for will never stop. They'll send others. They'll find Marcus eventually, and everyone who helped him will become a target. Then stop working for them. Stop being their weapon. You said this was about justice, about making the people who destroyed your life face consequences. But you're not serving justice. You're serving the same system that betrayed you in the first place." The words struck home. Claire could see Ethan processing them, connecting dots that he had refused to connect before. The people who had sent him here, who had funded this operation, who had promised him closure and vindication, they were not allies. They were handlers, and he was just another asset to be used and discarded. "Marcus didn't betray you," Claire continued, pressing her advantage. "He tried to expose something that was wrong, something that was being covered up by people with power and connections. And those same people have been manipulating you ever since, turning your grief and anger into a weapon they could aim at their enemies. How do you know that? How can you be sure? Because I've lived it, because I know what it feels like to discover that everything you believed in was built on lies. Because I spent 15 years hiding from my own past, trying to escape the same forces that have been hunting Marcus." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the doubt in his eyes, the cracks forming in the foundation of his certainty. 12 years ago, I was part of an operation that went wrong. Good people were hurt because of decisions made by commanders who cared more about politics than lives. I tried to report what happened through proper channels, and I was silenced, discredited, forced out of the only career I had ever known. I've been running ever since, just like Marcus, just like you should have been running, instead of letting them turn you into a weapon." Ethan's radio crackled again. One of his men reporting that police had breached the east entrance, another saying that the basement was compromised. The net was closing, and there was nowhere left to run. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, and his voice was no longer the voice of a commander. It was the voice of a lost man, seeking guidance he had never expected to need. "Tell the truth, all of it. The evidence Marcus has, combined with your testimony, could expose everything. The cover-ups, the corruption, the people who have been pulling strings from the shadows. You have a chance to actually achieve the justice you claim to want. Real justice, not revenge." The alarm continued its relentless scream. Water dripped from the ceiling where sprinklers had activated. Somewhere in the building, voices were shouting, doors were being forced open. The outside world was finally breaking through. Ethan looked at Claire for a long moment, and she saw the decision forming in his eyes. He reached for his radio and spoke clearly into it. "All units, stand down. I repeat, stand down. Lower your weapons and surrender to the authorities. The operation is over." Static, confusion, protests from men who had followed him into this building, expecting a very different outcome. But one by one, the acknowledgements came. The armed men who had controlled St. Jude Memorial Hospital for nearly 20 hours were laying down their weapons. Claire felt the tension drain from her body. It was not over yet. There would be questions, investigations, consequences that would unfold over weeks and months. But the immediate danger had passed. The people who remained in the building were safe. The police breach came minutes later. Officers in tactical gear swept through the corridors, securing each area, collecting weapons, taking the armed men into custody. They found Claire and Ethan standing together in the conference room, neither one resisting, both of them looking like survivors of a battle that had been fought with words as much as weapons. Claire was separated from Ethan and escorted to a staging area outside the hospital. The night air hit her like a physical force, cold and clean and infinitely precious. She had not realized how stifling the hospital had become until she was free of it. The scene outside was organized chaos. Ambulances lined up to transport anyone who needed medical attention. Families reunited with tears and desperate embraces. Media crews captured footage from behind police barriers, their cameras hungry for images of the crisis that had gripped the city. Claire found a quiet corner away from the commotion and sat down on a concrete barrier. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally receding, leaving behind an exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. She had done things tonight that she had sworn never to do again. She had reached into the past and pulled out skills and instincts that she had buried with intention, and in doing so, she had saved lives. But she had also destroyed the anonymity that had protected her for 15 years. A figure approached through the crowd. Marcus Webb, no longer hiding, his face showing the same mixture of relief and uncertainty that Claire felt. "They're going to want to talk to both of us," he said, sitting down beside her. "The police, the FBI, probably others, once they understand what this was really about. I know. I'm going to tell them everything. The evidence I've been hiding. The operation from 12 years ago. All of it. Whatever happens to me afterward, at least the truth will finally be out." Claire nodded slowly. "I'll corroborate what I can. My own experiences might help fill in some gaps." Marcus was silent for a moment, looking out at the flashing lights and milling crowds. "You saved a lot of people tonight. The children who escaped through the tunnel, the families who got out before things got worse. They owe their lives to you. I did what anyone would have done." "No. You did what almost no one could have done. Because of who you are, who you used to be. Don't diminish that." Claire considered his words. For so long, she had viewed her military past as a source of shame, a reminder of a life that had ended in betrayal and loss. But tonight, those same experiences had made the difference between tragedy and survival. Maybe it was time to stop running from who she was. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn appearing on the horizon. The longest night of Claire's life was finally ending. She thought about the patients still inside the hospital, the ones who had been too sick to move, who had remained in their rooms throughout the crisis, cared for by brave staff members who had refused to abandon them. She thought about Mrs. Henderson, the 80-year-old woman who always asked about her cat. She thought about Mr. Kowalski, the retired firefighter who could never sleep through the night. They had survived. They were safe. She thought about the armed men being loaded into police vehicles. Their operation failed, their futures uncertain. She thought about Ethan Cole, who had come seeking revenge and left with something more valuable, the chance to finally tell the truth about what had happened to him and why. And she thought about herself. Claire Dawson, night shift nurse. Claire Dawson, former Army Ranger. Two identities that had been kept separate for 15 years, now merged into something new. She did not know what that new identity would look like, or what her life would become once the investigations were complete and the media attention faded. but for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid of finding out. A police officer approached, asking if she was ready to give her statement. Claire stood up, straightened her rumpled scrubs, and followed him toward a waiting vehicle. The sun was rising over Denver, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. A new day was beginning, and Claire Dawson, no longer invisible, walked toward it with her head held high. The hospital behind her would recover. The patients would heal. The staff would return to their routines, forever changed by what they had experienced, but stronger for having survived it. And somewhere in that building, in the quiet corridors where she had spent so many nights, the memory of the nurse who had saved them all would remain, not as a ghost or a legend, but as a reminder that courage can be found in the most unexpected places, and that the people we overlook are sometimes the ones who matter most. Dear listeners, we hope that Claire's story has touched your hearts tonight. Her journey from invisibility to heroism reminds us that every person carries hidden depths, and that our greatest challenges often reveal our truest selves. If this story moved you, we have prepared a special playlist filled with equally captivating tales of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit. You can find it right here by clicking on your left. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of life, the bonds that connect us, and the extraordinary moments that define who we are. Don't miss our upcoming content. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us which moment touched you most, or share your own story of someone whose quiet courage made a difference. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Until next time, remember that heroes walk among us every day, often wearing the most ordinary disguises. We will see you in the comments.